happened to these children and your philosophy in dealing with them, frankly, seems detached from reality or any objective standard of decency or even common sense. And the court finds that it is appropriate that you serve a prison sentence.
Jodi Hildebrandt, the woman convicted of abusing the children of her co-defendant, YouTuber Ruby Franke, now wants to get out of prison early. And don't worry, Judge, she says the paperwork with all the details is in the mail. We're going to be taking a look at her application for post-conviction relief, how she's blaming her attorney for being behind bars, and the new rules in Utah that were sparked by this horrific abuse. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. It's been more than a year, believe it or not, since Jodi Hildebrandt and her business partner Ruby Franke were arrested for the horrific abuse of two of Ruby's children. The details that started coming out were just shocking. Ruby had a very popular YouTube channel called 8 Passengers that featured her family, including her now estranged husband Kevin and their 6 children. But in August of 2023, Ruby's 2 youngest children, who were 10 and 12, were found emaciated with wounds inside of Jodi's home in Ivins, Utah. Police would come to learn that the women had been abusing the children, basically torturing them for months that summer, making them stand outside in the heat, forcing one onto a cactus, denying them food and water, telling them that they were evil and deserved to be punished. Really, really horrible stuff. And Ruby and Jodi, they were each charged with 6 counts of aggravated child abuse, second-degree felonies. In December of 2023, the Washington County District Attorney announced that the women had agreed to take plea deals, which involved them pleading guilty to 4 of the 6 charges. Jodi's actions were detailed in her plea deal with the Washington County District Attorney. In fact, the paperwork lays out specific details about the abuse. For example, count 1 is related to Ruby's youngest son. RF was denied adequate water for several days. He was required to remain in the summer heat, and he was punished when he secretly consumed water. In addition, after RF attempted to run away in July, his hands and feet were regularly bound. Many times, the binding included using 2 sets of handcuffs, one of RF's wrists and one of the ankles. At times, with RF lying on his stomach, ropes were used to tie the 2 sets of handcuffs together so that his arms and lower legs were lifted off the ground. Count 3, connected to EF, this is Ruby's youngest daughter. The defendant's actions also caused severe emotional harm to EF. She was also repeatedly told she was evil and possessed. The punishments were necessary for her to be obedient and to repent, and these things were being done to her in order to help her. EF was convinced that she was evil and needed to go through these things in order to repent. And the guilty pleas meant that they didn't go to trial. They went directly to sentencing in February of 2024, where they were each sentenced to 4 to 30 years in prison. It's going to be up to the parole board to decide when they're released. And by the way, in her plea deal, in both of their plea deals, but since we're talking about Jodi, in her plea deal, it plainly states, I understand that I'm giving up my right to appeal my conviction if I plead guilty. Now, an appeal and post-conviction relief can be different, but still you get the idea. And now, Jodi is fighting to get out of prison, saying that her lawyer did a bad job, and basically she's throwing him under the bus. So I want to welcome in a friend of the show, back to the show, KUTV anchor and reporter Brian Schnee. So good to see you, Brian. A lot to catch up on. Let me just ask you real quick, before we even get into this more, are you surprised by this update, considering all that you have learned and all that you have studied about Jodi Hildebrandt?
No, nothing with Jodi Hildebrandt surprises me anymore, Jesse. It's the things that we've learned even after sentencing, right? A lot of these things just seem so far off and far out there for maybe the common individual to try and understand. So the fact that Jodi is trying to find a way to lessen her sentence or find a way to do something and completely pointing the finger at Doug Terry, saying he didn't read me my rights, he didn't do anything that he should have done, and this whole process was bogus, is basically what she's filing from behind bars. And it doesn't surprise me one bit, Jesse, especially because of how Jodi was so involved with all of this, yet so much focus for so long was on Ruby Franke.
It's a really good point, and that's what I want to get into. So let me expand upon this a little bit. So on Monday, Jodi Hildebrandt filed what is called a petition for relief under the Post-Conviction Remedies Act. Now, if you read the statute, it does provide some mechanisms to remedy even a potential wrongful guilty plea. For example, it reads, if the conviction for which the petitioner asserts factual innocence was based upon a plea of guilty, the petition shall contain the specific nature and content of the evidence that establishes factual innocence. Not sure we're talking about the same thing here because, look, The first issue for Jodi Hildebrandt is the court document indicates she is pro se, meaning she's representing herself. And as Brian said, she is claiming that her attorney, Douglas Terry, failed abysmally in making sure she knew what was going on in court and the consequences that she could face. Hey, real quick, I want to thank our sponsor, Odoo, for making Sidebar episodes like this possible. And this is for all you business owners out there, especially those of you thinking of starting a business. Odoo is an incredible all-in-one business management software, and it provides you with a range of applications like their website builder, with their drag and drop feature, an AI copywriter helping me come up with website descriptions, like building a website for my other show, Prime Crime, can do it in literally minutes. I mean, look how beautiful that is. Look how great that looks. So thank you to Odoo for sponsoring Sidebar, giving us the tools to build new sites, and you can do it too. The domain is free for the first year when you use our link, odoo.com/sidebarweb. Brian, before we go any further, what can you tell us about Jodi Hildebrandt's relationship with Douglas Terry? Have you ever seen any indicators of fractures in that relationship?
No, there was no fractures. I mean, Doug was in the courtroom sitting right next to Jodi every time that we were there and the cameras were rolling. It seemed like pretty standard. I mean, that's something that attorneys would definitely understand a little bit more than me as a reporter sitting on the other side about that dialogue that's had and that relationship that you build with your client, and seeing what that relationship turns into as it pertains to actually trying to maintain some level of innocence or lessen your chances of spending a lot of time in prison. So there was nothing really that stood out to me. It seemed pretty businesslike. But you know what's interesting is she basically just throws everything at Doug Terry here, who I did reach out to see if he would share some thoughts on this, and didn't get back to me before we were able to talk about this. But Doug Terry's really well respected in Washington County. His office is next to the courthouse, handles a lot of cases, is a career guy that's been doing this a long time, and is on a heavy load of cases right now from what I've been able to see in Utah's court system. So just kind of an interesting situation that we're dealing with right now, trying to figure out what Jodi Hildebrandt is after.
Let's talk about that. So just to get everybody caught up, after Christmas in 2023, Jodi entered her guilty plea in front of Judge John J. Walton.
Ms. Hildebrandt, how do you plead to count 1, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony?
Guilty.
And she went on to plead to 4 total counts. And outside the courthouse, Douglas Terry, her attorney, spoke with reporters indicating Jodi was remorseful.
I haven't had much to say about this case prior to today because I didn't feel it was appropriate to do so until today. Ms. Hildebrandt, my client, has pled guilty today to 4 counts. She has done so because she takes responsibility for her conduct in this matter. Her guilty pleas, she decided to plead guilty before Ms. Franke entered into her plea agreement or agreed to cooperate with the state. She has pled guilty because she did not want these children to have to testify. She takes responsibility. And it is her main concern at this point that these children can heal, both physically and emotionally.
Then, during sentencing, Jodi finally made a public statement. But you'll notice she never directly admits her guilt and doesn't say she's sorry.
I sincerely love these children. I desire for them to heal physically and emotionally. One of the reasons I did not go to trial is that I did not want them to emotionally relive the experience which would have been detrimental to them. My hope and prayer is that they will heal and move forward to have beautiful lives. I am willing to submit to what the state feels would be an appropriate amount of time served to make retribution.
Now, she says she's willing to submit to what the court feels is appropriate. Interesting there. Before we move on, Brian, throwing you back into this, in light of what we're about to get into, what did you make of her statements and Douglas Terry's statements?
Well, if we're talking about those statements that happened basically the day of her sentencing, it was very different than what we heard from Ruby Franke, right? And that was the focus of a lot of coverage. Is there was really no remorse here. It was kind of just a blank stare, a lack of understanding of maybe the egregious crimes that Jodi had previously allegedly now being convicted and actually sentenced to, what she had actually done. I felt like at that point, there was a lot of feeling like she just didn't get it. This woman just didn't get it of what she was putting these children through. And what's interesting is, as you've heard more come out about Jodi Hildebrandt through the form of a lot of documentaries and things, there was a lot of far-reaching things that Jodi was involved in and that she truly believed. I haven't watched the documentaries because I've spent so much of my life covering this case over the last couple of years, but I've heard through the grapevine of a lot of people that said, did you see what happened here? And those things don't surprise me either. So a lot of those mannerisms really align with her lack of really taking any accountability for what happened to Ruby Franke's kids under her own roof, which was just sold finally.
And now we take it into what's happening now, this idea of, is it consistent not taking accountability? Because she has now filed this post-conviction relief motion. And just to be clear, from a legal point of view, that can be a very difficult journey, and it becomes considerably more challenging if you voluntarily plead guilty. Now, there is a question if she voluntarily pled guilty, or at least she's trying to raise the question, because I want to talk about this petition for post-conviction relief. So in it, Jodi has filled out and checked certain boxes. For example, the document asks, what was your plea? Jodi indicates guilty. Did you testify at trial? She writes in, there was no trial. And then a little further down, did you appeal from the conviction or sentence? No. If you did not appeal from your conviction or sentence, why not? I did not understand my rights. Writes that in. Jodi Hildebrandt is essentially making the argument that she didn't really know what was going on. Look, the legal system can be quite intimidating and confusing, but that is why you have a lawyer there. But Jodi seems to be claiming that her lawyer wasn't doing the best thing for her, which is, of course, his job. Now, the relief paperwork continues with the reasons that Jodi selected as to why her case needs another look. And it seems that she actually wrote these in, meaning we're not even sure these would be adequate reasons for her to get relief under the law. But first it says, quote, conviction or sentence obtained by plea of guilty that was unlawfully induced or not made knowingly and voluntarily with understanding of the charge and consequences of the plea. Next, ineffective assistance of counsel. Terry did no investigation, advised waiver of preliminary hearing, and did not demand a bill of particulars to clarify the charges, did not explain the charging statute, did not negotiate a plea agreement that conformed to law, and did not advise Hildebrandt of her constitutional rights. Brian, thoughts on that before we move on?
Well, the whole thing's just rather interesting, right? And we've done some coverage on this here on the local level here in Utah. And one of my colleagues spoke to a former prosecutor here, now a defense attorney, who weighs in with some media coverage and really just called this a Hail Mary for Jodi Hildebrandt. I mean, making a true Hail Mary attempt at trying to get her sentence lessened at this point. Now, she's not up for a parole hearing at this point until 2026. They put that out so far, so we still don't really know where she stands in that 4 to 30 year spectrum. But he said the same thing. I mean, these post-conviction remedies are extremely difficult to actually have go forth, especially if you don't have any other representation on your side. Now, Doug Terry has the right here to go back and defend himself against these accusations as well. So Jodi will probably get her day back in court in some way, shape, or form, or some fashion, whether it's a virtual hearing from the Utah State Prison out by the Great Salt Lake, or maybe they bust her back down to Washington County. I don't know, but I think this is not surprising, like we said at the beginning, because Jodi seemed pretty lost through the entire process. To remember the day with her on the phone when officers came to her door, there were some lost moments there as well. And it all started with that for Jodi Hildebrandt. And then you really got into the deep dive of her history and all the people that came out of regarding connections, classrooms, and all the things that she was doing to breaking apart relationships. We could talk about this for hours, Jesse. Jodi Hildebrandt is an interesting human being, and this doesn't surprise me one bit. But again, a Hail Mary attempt.
Your memory is probably much better than mine. Do you remember when she was in court and she was, accepting this plea deal and was going to be sentenced and pled guilty? Was she advised? I mean, let me rephrase this. Do you remember if the court said to her, do you realize what you're pleading guilty to? Do you understand you're relinquishing your rights? I seem to remember that, unless I'm wrong. I mean, you tell me.
At the time of our conversation when we're sitting here, I don't have the clip in front of me, but I can replay it in my mind because I was sitting in the spot in the courtroom where normally a jury would sit, because that's where they stashed a bunch of us reporters. So I was looking right at Jodi Hildebrandt as Judge Walton was speaking to her. And they went through the book just like everything else, Jesse. I would have it a hard time thinking those things were never said. I maybe 95% certain. How about that? Because I can't replay it, I guess, in full in my brain. But I would have a hard time thinking that she was never actually read her rights and actually was gone through some of those things. Because she says in this document here, she was never made aware of her rights.
But she signed the plea agreement. She signed it.
Yeah.
She signed it,
Yeah.
and you're expected to read it, right? But look, here's the thing. She doesn't just blame her defense attorney. She seems to blame the prosecution too, because her third reason for why she says she needs post-conviction relief
Misconduct.
is prosecutorial misconduct, conviction or sentence obtained by the constitutional failure of the prosecution to provide the defendant adequate notice of the charges, negotiation of an unlawful plea agreement. Fourth reason, plain error. Conviction or sentence obtained by failure of the court to enforce defendant's constitutional right to adequate notice of the charges, accepted guilty plea to unlawful plea agreement. And her fifth and final reason, structural error, denial of Hildebrandt's due process rights for adequate notice of charges and accurate application of the law governing the terms of the plea agreement. Brian, I don't quite understand it, and I don't know if you had an opportunity to speak to the prosecutors in this case, but your thoughts on this one?
Well, I do know that Jodi decided to send her evidence and findings in the mail, so it'll eventually get to Washington County some way, shape, or form from the Utah State Prison. But I have not spoken to the prosecutors, and I didn't get a chance to speak with Doug Terry, although I tried yesterday when we were on Thursday when we were lining up this conversation to make sure if Doug had something to say, I wanted to make sure that was out there. But he was always very quiet from the very beginning about speaking about his client in this case. It was kind of texts and emails didn't work. It had to be a phone call or it had to be in person. So I didn't expect him to get back to me pertaining to what Jodi has had to say here. At the end of the day, I'd be interested to see what she writes down, right? What does it look like in Jodi's eyes? Because she wrote all this. She wrote these things. I mean, maybe there's some assistance there with somebody she knows and somebody advised her in a phone call, but at the end of the day, has no one representing her. And she's putting together this kind of A, B, C, D, E, and F of what went wrong here in Jodi Hildebrandt's eyes. And some of them seem to be a little, not an attorney, but a little far reaching, given the crimes that were levied against her in basically with her role with Ruby Franke, right?
And there's another issue I want to get to want to talk to you about as well that's beyond Jodi Hildebrandt, but just to put a bow on this, yeah, you're right. So she indicated, or this document indicates, that someone seeking post-conviction relief needs to include paperwork that explains the reasoning and offers up facts and evidence that would be presented as evidence. And Hildebrandt writes, a Rule 65C Memorandum of Points and Authorities, which presents all pertinent facts and applicable authorities, is being placed in the prison mail system today. So that was on Monday, March 24th. By the way, Rule 65C does appear to be about post-conviction relief. And Jodi again states that her attorney didn't do his due diligence. None of the enumerated grounds were previously presented to any court. I did not know my rights, and my attorney did not inform me of them. But I actually want to switch gears right now with Brian. And I want to talk about how Ruby and Jodi's case has impacted the law in Utah. So the whole case helped shine a light on family vlogging, which has really taken off in Utah in recent years. And many states have laws in the books to protect child performers, especially financially. But with the rise in online content, children participating in family vlogs, they need to be protected too. And Utah State Representative Doug Owens sponsored a bill to update the state's laws when it comes to children contributing to their household's finances. In fact, online content creators who make more than $150,000 a year from content featuring their kids will be required to set aside 15% of the earnings into a trust fund that can be accessed when the child turns 18. And it also has a stipulation that once the child becomes an adult, they can request that their images be removed. Now, Kevin Franke, Ruby's estranged husband, has been a staunch supporter of this bill, as has the Franke's oldest child, Shari Franke. They both spoke at separate hearings or separate meetings of the House Business and Labor Committee. Take a look.
In any other context, it is understood that children cannot give consent, but for some reason, people think family vlogging is different. I did not realize the impact that filming as a child would have on me now. My social media became flooded with rumors of having sexual relations with my own brother, to being called a baby birthing machine at the age of 13. All these things have stuck with me, and and I will forever live between the ages of 13 to 17 in many of my viewers' minds. In addition, pedophiles stalk the internet, specifically seeking out child influencers. I promise you that the parents are aware of these predators and choose to post their children anyway. I want to be absolutely clear that there is no amount of money that can justify selling your soul as a child to the world. In no other industry would we justify unregulated child labor with a huge paycheck, and we should not do that here. If I could go back and do it all again, I'd rather have an empty bank account now and not have my childhood plastered all over the internet. No amount of money I received has made what I've experienced worth it. Family vlogging ruined my innocence long before Ruby committed a crime. I promise you that my experiences are not unique and are happening to child influencers all over Utah and the country. So let's tackle this issue before it becomes a bigger crisis than it already is.
And then Kevin read statements into the record from two of his daughters, starting with words from one of his middle daughters.
This bill should be passed. Smiley face. Had it been in place when my family was doing YouTube, my mom would not have been able to withdraw all of my savings I had from doing YouTube. This bill will prevent other kids from having to go through the pain of realizing that the compensation for years' worth of time and effort is suddenly gone. Another thing this bill would do that should have been done a long time ago is give adults over the age of 18 the right to have monetized images and videos of themselves taken off social media platforms from when they were kids. As kids, you don't realize what you're subjected to. Really, you're selling your life, your privacy, your body, and stories to the entire world. And as a child, you're involuntarily giving up all of that. You're selling your childhood.
And Kevin also read a statement from EF, the youngest Franke child who was abused in Jodi Hildebrandt's home.
I think these new rules will keep the children of Utah more safe because I know more about the horrible situation that a lot of kids are in right now more than anyone. When I was on YouTube, I thought nothing was wrong. I felt, quote unquote, happy, but I really wasn't. When I started getting older, I realized the YouTube channel had ruined my childhood, but at least I got some money, right? Oh, right. I actually didn't because my mom withdrew all of it in 2023. I worked hard for that money. I acted like someone I wasn't in front of that camera, and I earned that money, but I feel like my mom used me for money. I know many of the YouTube channels out there today deny this and say their channels are different and their kids choose it and don't act in front of the camera, but every YouTuber parent expects their kids to act a certain way. Even if the kids themselves do a channel, they deserve the money, not the parents.
And on Tuesday, Utah Governor Spencer Cox signed the bill into law, a win for those advocating for some of the state's most vulnerable individuals. Brian, what did you make of those statements from Shari, from Kevin, from the daughters, and talk to us about the significance of this legislation?
Well, it's a big deal. There's a lot of children in Utah. It's the youngest state in the nation. And for that reason, there's a lot of protections and legislation that is run focused on children. Now, it's not just this bill that had direct implications from Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt's actions. There are also child torture amendments and other conversations about aggravated child abuse and upping that charge. And there was a lot of things that went into play as a result of Franke and Hildebrandt's actions that eventually came to light and resulted in guilty pleas and jail time. But when it comes to the child actor situation, content creation's big in Utah. It's big since I've been here about 5.5 years ago. I noticed that when I moved here, a lot of families, there's a lot of let's go to the national parks, or let's take our kids to Disneyland, or let's go do this. And it's not as targeted towards the kids that I've noticed as 8 Passengers was. So much of 8 Passengers was focused on, hey kid, what do you think about this? Or let's put you on screen when you're having your worst day, or you're being disciplined, or you're not being able to eat, or you're sleeping on the floor. Like, those are things that we're not seeing in some of the other content creators that are really kind of just showing a more positive light. And that's why 8 Passengers got so much attention. So here, the children will start to get some money. They'll have it in form of a trust that goes into play, May 7th, 2025. It results in people that actually make money from content creation over six figures. And you mentioned that 150K with a 15% kickback in the trust, supposed to be put in around January of every single year. And then once they become 18, they can scrub that content. So a lot of these things are in place to try to protect the children that are being, in a way, exploited by their parents. If this is their main line of financial gain as a content creator, it just brings so many thoughts to my mind because this is so popular right now with so many people just trying to make it on social media, trying to monetize. I see it every single day. What I see isn't typically involving a family with children, might just be the algorithm. But at the end of the day, this could really help people that don't want to go through this certain situation like we've seen with the Franke kids.
And you wish it didn't have to take a case like the Frankes for this to bring some attention to this and for there to be a change.
Absolutely.
I will just ask you, the idea of following this case for so long and hearing the words from, EF or a middle daughter, that was big. That was significant because we hadn't really heard from them, right?
No, and you wouldn't expect it, right? I mean,
Right.
11 years old. But I'm not surprised that Kevin went and brought forth that emotional sort of testimony, right, to the committee. It's interesting because EF said at the time I didn't really realize what was going on. Then I got older. And that's what I realized while following this case is I do believe there were moments where the kids just thought they were having fun and mom's just messing around with a cell phone and probably didn't understand that maybe at one point this was their way of life or how they were able to afford the house or meals at some points if they were so lucky, right? It's one of those things that it probably took a turning point in life or a maturity or something to really realize, hey, this is my family's primary source of income and I'm a big part of it. I don't think an 8-year-old would understand that, right? This is something that probably takes somebody telling you, drilling it into your head or years of maturity. So I think those words were powerful. Kevin Franke relentlessly going to Utah's Capitol Hill over this bill was a huge role in getting this passed, was a really big influence because think what you want about Kevin and what he may or may not have known, but Kevin was trying to do this for the better of not just his children and their image and all of this, but the future and changing lives and changing laws. And I think a lot of people had a great deal of respect for that. Ultimately, the governor putting pen to paper just a few days ago on the 25th of March for a very impactful bill for content creators in the state of Utah.
Yep, and we'll see if it trickles down to other states as well, even though there are certain protocols put in place by other states. This is a big one. Brian Schnee, thank you so much for coming on. Let everybody know where they can find you and get the information.
Don't let me go yet. Don't let me go yet. I have one thing from Kevin Franke for you that I did.
Oh, let me know. Let me know.
I did trade messages with Kevin about 24 hours after this was signed, and he shared a couple words with me. I didn't ask for an interview, but just some thoughts because he's been very forthcoming about this. He just said, quote, "This is an excellent first step in protecting child influencers on social media. However, there is much more work to be done to expose the systemic exploitation of children and family content creation on social media and to create more impactful legislation to protect those children." That was from a text with Kevin about 24 hours after that bill was signed. And I wanted to make sure I shared that with you and the folks that'll watch this.
Appreciate that. Wow. So it seems like he's going to be advocating, continuing the fight. We will see what happens next. But again, Brian Schnee, thank you so much for coming on, taking the time. Let everybody know where they can find you and the work that you do.
Thanks, Jesse. Didn't mean to cut you off there. But as always, we're here in Utah, based out of Salt Lake City, but covering cases all across the state. We're KUTV2 News on Salt Lake City, but focus really on the broader state of Utah. You can find us at KUTV.com and also on our YouTube channels and social media platforms, whatnot. By the way, there's always a lot of interesting crime-related news out of Utah, so I'm sure we'll be making an appearance again to share some of those things with you, Jesse.
Absolutely. Brian Schnee, thanks so much. Great seeing you.
Thanks for having me.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. Speak to you next time.